OLC24Apr19ValJanis Imachapi. I want to apologize first of all to my elders for speaking. I'm not an elder yet, so I'm going to try and teach you guys what I know. But I know there's a lot of different teachings and a lot of different ways. So this is the way that I learned. This is the way I raised my children. We're going to kind of talk a little bit about the purpose of Cradlboards, the construction, and then how to use them, and different ways that I've learned. So the purpose of the Cradlboard, what the grandmas taught me, was it gave the baby security. They were always in the womb, so they were tight. So when you put them in the Cradlboard, they still have that security with them, so they cry less, which I can attest to as I raised my 3 children in Cradlboards. They didn't cry as much, and they were very quiet. It makes them visually aware. When they're sitting up in the Cradlboard, they're watching everything around them. And so it makes them aware of not so much of themselves, but of their environment. And that's the traditional thinking is, you know, it's about the teoshpe and the people, not so much about yourself. And it assists the mothers in reducing stress of having a new baby, because you're always feeling like you need to hold them. In the Cradlboard, they cry less, so then you don't have to hold them as much. And they are more content. So practicing the native parenting skills will provide continuation for native culture for future generations. A child uses them for the first 2 to 3 years of life. Some of the kids use them a little bit more, but my children used them up to about they were 2.5. The boards get really big. I'm sure I could have used them until they were like 4, you know, get past those 3s, but the board would have been taller than me probably. So, and when I used to put my younger children in, I have 3, my older ones would lay on the floor, they would lay out a blanket, and they would fold over the edge, and they would ask to be wrapped up. So I would have 1 in the Cradlboard or 2 in the Cradlboard, and the older one would be wrapped up, laying on the floor, and they'd all be watching cartoons. So it really helped. And then when you put a baby in a Cradlboard, a lot of people I've seen, I bring this pillow with me. You never lay them flat. A lot of people don't know that whenever you lay them flat, then they can spit up and stuff, and they don't have that mobility to wiggle around. So you don't lay them flat in the Cradlboard because they can choke. So you always have it underneath a pillow or something to that extent. Health risk. Well, a lot of people said that the Cradlboard helped reduce the problem with SIDS because you didn't have to worry about blankets being near their mouth, that type of thing. I can attest to that. I mean, all my kids were safe in the Cradlboard, but I don't know the statistics on that. And it gives your baby more neck support and head support while they're resting. And it helps moms, young moms. I was a 17-year-old mom, and if I didn't have the Cradlboard, I'm pretty sure I would have pulled all my hair out. I was going to college at the same time I had all 3 of my children. So with them in the Cradlboard, I could do my homework, I could do whatever I needed to, and they were content to be beside me. So the Cradlboard really helped. This right here shows pictures of all 3 of my children in their Cradlboards. Last year we had an issue when we were moving. The Cradlboards got destroyed, so we had to burn them. But we would have kept them for them, but we didn't have. So I don't have any to show you with my kids raised. We had to destroy them. So the pros of using a Cradlboard is your hands are free. You don't have to worry about your baby as much. Your baby is quieter. You have your cultural aspect. You're able to get stuff done. The babies are more physically aware of their environment, and they learn patience and calmness. And they're usually not startled very often. We used to play music. I've heard moms go shh every time their baby was sleeping. We never did that. We had them in the cradle boards playing AC/DC, so they were fine with the noise. The cons of using the cradle board are sometimes it takes a little bit to put them in and out. Takes a little while to get used to that. And some people's lack of understanding. I'd say that's probably the biggest con to using a cradle board. Even now, I've had people say they were going to call social services on me because I was child abusing my child by having it in the cradle board. So you have to have that resilience to go, well, I'm not hurting my child. She's sleeping. How is that child abuse? And you've got to have that strength to go, this is my culture. So, and then carrying and holding them as they get bigger. My kids were about 25, 30 pounds by the time, or more, by the time we were done using the cradle board. So after they get about 2, it gets really heavy to be trying to carry them or move them around while they're in the board. So the first type, when you're doing construction of cradle boards, you have to figure out what type you're going to do. These boards right here, these are for the Lakota style cradle board, like this one. So I'll explain the boards and everything in a minute. And then this is the rounded top. This is actually kind of like the Nest Purse style, but the Nest Purse style is more of a like a light bulb shape. I just rounded the top. And the reason I started using these is because my oldest daughter, I had her in a Lakota style cradle board, and I went to move her so I could feed her, and the point went right into my neck. And after that, I didn't like it, so then I started using the rounded top cradle boards. So it kind of depends on what type you want. When you're making the cradle boards, I suggest pine wood because it's very, very light. Cedar smells really good, but it's actually kind of a little bit of a hardwood, so it's a little heavier. And then you use these boards. So I'm going to use the explain the Lakota style and see if I can do this while holding a microphone. So when you're constructing a Lakota style cradle board, you have the 2 long boards, and depending on how big your rounded nest is, like this type right here. So this is the one from the archives. So this is one that doesn't have the boards to it. But whenever you decide how big, you would want your boards to come up a little bit higher, at least a foot above the cradle board. So you have to decide how big you want your cradle board to begin with. And then it's a lot simpler than most people think. I have my 2 tall boards, and then I have 2 smaller boards. One's for the middle, one's for the bottom. And then you just drill your holes into the boards, all of them. And then you're using sinew and you do an X. And then you're going to knot it. And I don't have the holes drilled, so I can't demonstrate that part of it. And then modern-wise, before you used to have to use leather or that type of thing. So modern cradle boards, I use stabilizer, the thickest stabilizer you can find. And we put that underneath the fabric. And this right here in between this is stabilizer too. And then the material-wise, I use a heavy-duty canvas. And the reason I use that is I'll show you when I put my my helper down here into the cradle board to show you how to do that. And you're just going to cut a long strip. And it's about 3 inches tall. And then you're just going to put the fabric around it and sew it, almost like a pillowcase. And then you sew these 2 together. So both of these would be covered in fabric, and then you sew them together, and you sew your leather on. And it'll end up looking like this. So when you sew this piece, so they come together at the bottom, and then you just sew it, and then you attach it to the back piece. And the back piece is what you're going to sew onto the boards. It's really difficult to show you guys how to construct it, because usually a lot of people ask me how long it takes me to make a Cradlboard. Sewing it by hand, it can take up to 3 days. Beading depends on how fast you bead. But constructing it itself, we've done 8-hour classes, and they still weren't able to get it completely done. So it usually takes about 12 to 15 hours to do one Cradlboard. And that's not adding all the decorative beading or anything else you want to. That's just sewing it. And the 8-hour class, we were using sewing machines, and we still weren't able to complete it because it took so long and it was hard to. And it could have been possibly because it was their first time. The more you make, the faster it goes. So it usually takes about a day to make a Cradlboard. This type right here is a lot easier to make, because all you do is you cut the rounded top and sand it. And then this material, if you look, it's just sewn actually like a pillowcase. And then you just slip this board in this fabric. So that's the way that these ones are made, and then you sew another piece of fabric onto it. And so it depends on what kind you like to use. I mean, it depends on what type of style. My oldest one had a completely fabric slipped over top of it, and we sewed it on the bottom. And we made like a little nest. And you guys can come up and look at the pictures and see what they look like. So I actually do have a list for you guys if you guys want it. It's a list of supplies and a way to construct. So you guys can come take that if you want. And we have a lovely copy machine over there if we don't have enough copies. So the next part, I'm not going to be able to use the microphone because I need both hands. So I'm going to show you how you put a baby in the Cradlboard, and then talk to you a little bit about how old they have to be and that type of stuff. So usually in the Cradlboard, when you put your baby in, this is ZB. This is my daughter's real baby, so we're using him for our example because I don't have young kids anymore. But when you put your baby in the Cradlboard, I've had moms come up to me with 6 months old and ask me to put their baby in a Cradlboard. You can't do that. If they're not used to being swaddled, that's almost like torturing them. So 4 days after they're born, you put them in the Cradlboard. That's the way that I've learned it. When you make, each baby has a turtle and a lizard. That's the way that I was taught. The lizard is the decoy. The turtle is where their umbilical cord goes. The other way that I taught is that each baby has their first pair of moccasins, and on the bottom of the moccasin, you poke a hole into the bottom of the moccasin. That way, if any bad sickness or bad spirits or anything come through the baby through the soft spot, if there's a hole in the moccasin on the left side, it'll go through the baby and the baby will be okay. And that's traditionally how the grandmas taught me, and each one of my kids' moccasins have holes in them on the bottoms, just because that's a traditional way of thinking. Usually with this, I use a receiving blanket. During the summer, when you put your baby into the Cradlboard, nothing but a diaper. They will get really warm really fast. Wintertime, it's great. But even in wintertime, I've never put them in anything besides a onesie. That's the only type of thing that you put them in, and at the most you put them in a diaper, or I mean the least. So receiving blanket, I don't have one for him. This is just a blanket I folded, but you're just going to do it like you normally would swaddle. You fold down one corner of it and you put the baby down. Now newborns, their tendency is just like this. Their hands curl, their legs pull up. That's just their natural way of doing things. So you very gently put the hands down by the sides and pull the blanket over and tuck one side under. The reason we put the hands down by the sides and not like this, like how sometimes when you swaddle they put the hands up, is because when you put them in the Cradlboard and their hands are crossed, these will dig into their arms. Because you need to tie it enough to secure them so you can hurt their arms if you don't have them down by their sides. So that's the reason why we do the hands down by the sides. And then you're just going to pull your end up so their little toes can't escape through the holes right here. And then you pull this side over. And then you pull your baby in. Obviously I wouldn't hold the baby exactly like that if it was real. And then you just slide him down. Now, some of the Cradlboards that I've made, there's a lot of material, extra material, so it can grow with the baby. So I'll put an extra blanket behind the baby. And right now this is a towel, a blanket over top of towel. You can use a cushion that you can buy at Hobby Lobby or something like that. And then you just pull their feet in. And then when you're tying, you always want to make sure it's snug, but not where it's going to hurt them. So I've always, when I've tied, I've always been able to stick my fingers in between. Now whenever they're older, 6 months, a year, they start becoming Houdinis. And so I've actually cut strips of sheets. And if you'll see my son, his feet would always stick out. So I cut strips of sheets and I would wrap it underneath just so that way he couldn't like stick all his toes out. He seriously used his toes to start untying some of the ties. It was kind of funny. So I would have to be careful with that. And then you just tie a bow. The reason I have strings on both sides, if you notice, it's a lot easier to just tie and then let them out easier. And I've always only just did a bow tie, so you can just pull a side off and you can get the baby out real easy. Another question I've gotten is, how long have you let your baby be in there? Well, a couple times throughout the night, of course through the night, but then I would take them out, change their diaper, put them back in. At the most during the day, they would go for 2 to 3 hours, and then I would let them out, kick around, and then they would go back in again. So sometimes they would come out for an hour or two, and they would go back in. And depending on if we went on trips or that type of thing, obviously would have a cedar. So you would cut a young sapling cedar and you would cut it in half and soak it for 4 days, and then you would bend it like this. And the reason you do that is because if they fall over, that cedar bough is real flexible, so it would catch it and it would always go across where their head is. So you would attach that. I don't know how fast I talked. But are there any kind of questions or anything?
What's the philosophy behind the Cradlboard?
Well, I kind of covered that a little bit earlier, but the philosophy is that when the baby's in the Cradlboard, they're focused on the tailspay and they're not focused on themselves. So they learn by watching. A lot of our teachings, you know, the children they don't speak out of turn or ask their elders a lot of questions, so they learn by observation. And so the Cradlboard was a way that they could do that naturally.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Is there any other questions?
Where did the Cradlboard and the thinking, the philosophy behind it, where did that come from?
I actually have not heard any of the grandmas tell me the philosophy behind the Cradlboard. They've just told me why we use them, and I have no idea when they started. That would be a very interesting thing to see if any of the elders know that now, but I know that each tribe has a different version of it. There's types that have rounded, there's the Lakota style, which is actually pretty unique in itself. The Ojibwe style is just a square board that has a piece of fabric that wraps and the baby's feet are out. Each Cradlboard is unique. There's different stories for each one, but I have not heard the Lakota story for the Cradlboard. Are there any other questions?
So why is the bottom stitched then? Is that to protect so the baby didn't slip out, or?
Yeah, usually the bottom, like this one, is actually tied with leather, just because the leather's a little bit stronger. So you would lace it so that they would have a brace in there, and sometimes you would put a wooden board on the bottom so they would have like a board to put their feet on, and it'll help them. Another reason we don't stand them straight up like this is because a baby's legs are not very strong. So with that pressure and the weight of them, their legs would bend and it would be too much for them. So that's why you usually keep them at the most like this. So I used to put them on the armrest of the couch or leaning up like that. But you never put them like straight up or anything. Any other questions?
So, you see some old pictures of them carrying them on their back, so how would you do that?
So where the cedar boughs attach, they'd have two holes right here usually, or on the Lakota one it would be roughly the same area where their head is. And they would have a leather strap that is attached right there, and it comes up like this, and it's really long. And we did that for my daughter's first one. And I have to be honest, I did try to put her on my back. And it was kind of scary because I was like, can't tell where she's at. So I would hold this, and then we tied a sheet around me just to make sure. I mean, those women were really strong in the past because I was scared I'd drop her. But there is a leather strap that goes up from where the cedar bough attaches, and it comes up like this. And it's usually about this thick, so it can go on your forehead and hold the baby's weight. And they're not really heavy whenever they're newborns when you put them on your head. So, and you can kind of feel when they start moving around. I've noticed that. So that's probably, if I would have kept doing it, I would have been used to that feel, and I would have known when she was awake or that type of thing. I'm sure that's how they can tell, because you can feel it shifting on your head when they move.